Edge research. Amazing. So last but not least, we have Dr. Louise Lambert with us. She is the editor and founder of the Middle East Journal of Positive Psychology. Her next book, Positive Psychology in the Middle East/North Africa, Research, Policy, and Practice, takes a look at all things related to well-being and happiness across the Middle East region, including health, education, policy making, infrastructure, big data, religion, culture, and more. Dr. Lambert has lived in the UAE for 10 years and is also a researcher, professor, and capacity building lead with Emirates Center for Happiness Research and the United Arab Emirates University. The title of her presentation is Beyond Building, Creating Homes with Human Value. Please welcome Dr. Lambert.
Thank you for not leaving. This is the worst slot to have, the very end, so I will try to be a little bit more entertaining just to keep you here. So I have the unenviable position of speaking last, but one of the benefits of that is I was able to rewrite my speech a little bit last night and cut out what everybody else had already said, but I wasn't able to cut out what people said today, so I'm just going to gloss over some of that so I don't bore you. All right, I don't know how to use a Mac, so okay, perfect. Okay, so what I wanted to do today is just give you just some thoughts, essentially, on some of my, I guess, kind of the lived experience of, I initially called this Confessions of a Box Dweller. I'll talk about my box that I'm residing in currently, and then tie that a little bit to what some of the research literature has to say about the impact of infrastructure on well-being, and then end with a couple of recommendations, I guess, for people who are in the field, either that's well-being or from infrastructure perspective. So I want to talk a little bit just briefly about what is positive psychology. It is not so new in the US. It began in 2000, was introduced by Dr. Martin Seligman, and it's essentially taking the positive side of life and human experience just as seriously as we do the miserable side of life and human experience. And that actually, that emphasis on well-being is very critical because for a long time, psychology has focused on this bottom part, so the experience of negative emotions. So we can tell you everything there is to know about being miserable, about being anxious, about being angry, but the thinking was if we just reduce negative emotions, then suddenly we had happy people. But actually we found that that is not true. So when we remove or when we make people less depressed, less miserable, they're just not depressed and not miserable. They're just languishing. And so they're just kind of hanging around in zero. They're just hanging around in neutral. And positive psychology is really about paying attention, to the negative, but more than that, paying attention to people who are languishing, who maybe don't necessarily experience positive emotions, but also don't necessarily experience negative emotion. And then also thinking about what contributes to moving people up that scale of human experience and to pushing them into the flourishing zone. So how do we add positive emotions and add positive experience, and what actually contributes to a life well lived? And so that's one of the major differences. And this interest was formalized, again, as I said, in 2000, and it has moved into other parts of the world, so most recently into the Middle East. So if you did not know, the UAE has a Minister of Happiness and Well-being. She was nominated, Her Excellency Hud Al-Rumi was appointed in 2016, I believe. And since then, we've had a number of different developments. So the World Government Summit meets every year. Well-being and happiness is a major issue that gets tabled. But also, if we look to neighboring Saudi Arabia, happiness and well-being has now become part of Vision 2030. Also in Kuwait, there's a fantastic nonprofit organization that has been operating since 2007. They've been having conferences on positive psychology and really moving positive psychology into the community zone. So helping Kuwaitis find greater meaning and purpose and community life in that nation. Out of these developments has also come a lot of research, so we'll toot my own horn here. So our book was just published actually 2 days ago, otherwise I would have brought copies, so it was a month early actually, by Springer. And we covered how positive psychology affects a number of different dimensions. So health, positive education, organizations, policymaking, and infrastructure being one of those. And that chapter was led by Ms. Aubrey-Lynn Reeder, and I was able to sort of hop along for the ride for that. And it's in writing, co-writing that chapter that I started to get interested in this idea of well-being and infrastructure and kind of looking at what the research literature had to say, but also finding my own experience in that research, which is what I'll talk about today. So if you're not familiar, I know people have talked about Dubai. Dubai is actually a city and an emirate. People confuse Dubai and the country. So Dubai is not a country. The United Arab Emirates is the country. It has 7 different emirates, and Dubai is one of those. And yes, everything you've heard about Dubai in terms of architecture and infrastructure is true. It is amazing. We have all these cool, fantastic buildings. The building on the right is about half built at the moment. It will be the Museum of the Future. We also have a Minister of the Future, by the way. We have a lot of cool stuff. The Twisty building, that's up in the marina. Of course, the Burj, which is the tallest building in the world, which is in the top left. So lots of great spaces. But like every place, we also have spaces that are a little bit less great. And so it's, I just want to be clear, it's not a criticism of the UAE, but it's more an invitation to think about how can we do things a little bit better. So some of the not so great spaces kind of look like this. And this is an example of expatriate housing. And so when you move to the UAE, you need to be on a work visa. And most organizations will provide that housing for you. And depending on what package you are on, it's either a wildly fantastic package with a great big villa or a little bit less fantastic, and it's more just normal average housing. And so, you know, thinking about the expat experience, we just kind of take a look at some of the numbers. We'll just kind of give you an idea of exactly how many expats we're talking about. So in the United States, if we think about people who come from other countries, it's certainly not a majority. In the GCC countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, of which there are 6 listed here on the left, it is by far a very big number. So if we look at Qatar, if we look at the UAE, it is an overwhelming majority. So in the UAE, we are almost 90% of the population, and the national population is sitting at about 10%. So expats are the whole place pretty much. So when we're talking about housing for expats, it's pretty much where everybody lives, and then the nationals, of course, have their own housing. And so what I want to talk today is more around expat housing. And just to be clear, there is a difference when you talk about expats. So I won't be talking about the laborers, but more just the sort of middle-class economic migrants who go to the GCC countries to work. So when I changed job, I was given, well, actually I was given no options, but I threw a little tantrum and said, no, I want some options in terms of where I'm going to be living. And this is not the actual building where I live. My building has a wall around it, and I didn't take a picture of it because there's actually nothing to take a picture of. It's a wall, which is a little bit strange, and I'll explain to you what that is in a moment. But just to give you an idea of the 3 options. So the first option I was given was a 2-bedroom apartment, and the windows, curiously, started about here, so I had to stand on my tippy toes to look outside, and I thought, this is very strange, I'm not sure what that's about. I declined that one. The second apartment was super cute, it was amazing, lots of sunshine, it was fantastic, but very, very, very small. There was no closets, there was no cupboards, there was just no space to put anything. So I would have had to include all of that, and in which case my bed would not have fit or any other human other than myself. So I also said no to that one. The third place I went to had gigantic windows. It was a 3-bedroom apartment, plus a maid's room. It was huge. And like most people, I thought size is bigger, right? So size matters. So I said yes to the bigger apartment. But I saw that apartment at night. And so when I went back the next day, I realized every single window, while great, is facing a wall. I'm not sure why, but so I get light, I just don't actually see anything. So there's a big giant wall around my whole building, and it's not like there's a yard in between, it's maybe about 1.5 feet away. So, and before you get excited that there's a tree there, it's actually not a tree, it's a big weed. But I don't want to say anything because they're going to come and cut it down, and that's my only little piece of greenery. So that's one of my windows. I do save on curtains. This is the other window. The wall is not quite as high, so I get a little bit of sunshine there. So just a lot of oddities. Now, I realize these are first world problems. I have a home. It's 3 bedrooms. It's huge. Otherwise, it's not so bad. But again, it's more about, can we just do things differently? If we're going to build homes anyways, can we just build them so that people can actually see outside? So when I saw this, at first I kind of laughed, like, oh, okay, that's kind of funny. And then I quickly realized, no, this is not going to work, and it's not that funny, actually. And I started feeling pretty boxed in. I thought, well, okay, let's see what work looks like. So maybe I'll have more luck at work. And no, not much more luck at all. So this is the office. Also no windows, but behind these chairs, there's one of these kind of fake separating walls. And sometimes I can move into sociology, and they have windows that look like this. So, yeah. So on any given day, when I'm driving to and from work, which I could probably walk to, it would be 5 minutes, but I have to cross an 8-lane freeway. So I'm stuck using my car to drive 12 minutes. I get sunshine, go into work, no sunshine. 12 minutes back home, back into my apartment, no sunshine. So when I asked HR about this, I'm like, hey, I'm not liking my place, don't want to sound ungrateful, but is there a possibility of moving? And they said, what's the problem? And I said, well, I can't actually see outside. And they said, yeah. Okay, well, I can't actually see outside. Let me try that again. And their response was, well, but then you have your privacy. I said, yeah, I get that, but yeah. Okay, so that's where that ended. That was kind of a moot point. But the net result, though, is that, so when I sort of thought about what is the impact on that, what is the impact on me of not being able to see outside? And for one, I don't spend a lot of time in this place. So that means that HR of the organization I work for is giving me a huge apartment in which I spend no time. So I drive in on Sunday morning, my class is at 3, I sleep Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday, my class finishes at 3 o'clock, we don't teach on Thursdays, and I go straight to Dubai. When I'm in Dubai, I do my groceries, I go to the gym, I do my shopping, meet with my friends. Economically, I invest in an entirely different city simply because the housing that I have is not conducive to living. So I end up kind of treating it more like a hotel, drop my bags, go to sleep, leave again, versus a home in which I actually want to spend a lot of time. So again, this is a waste of resources, an extra cost on my part, because now I keep an apartment in a different city on top of an apartment that I already have, but also in terms of productivity. So I spend a lot of time in coffee houses and not necessarily in my apartment or in my office. So when we look at this from an organizational perspective, this is one good example of where housing, the physical spaces in which we inhabit, actually do have an impact on us, but also have an impact on what we actually do there. But if we add just one more lens on top of that and think about what that means for expatriates. So when we move to a different country, everything's new. It's a new way of driving, a new way of dressing, a new way of relating, a new way of speaking, a new way of eating, a new way of banking. We have to learn a new job, different social hierarchies, different systems of privilege. We have to build new social networks and continuously be building those social networks because expats are a pretty transient society. People come and go all the time. We have new equipment, new professional and ethical standards, different stakeholders, different rules of how to do things. It's all very disorienting. And the one thing that we should be able to count on is a home in which we can go. And so those protective factors for well-being become much smaller when we think about what that means in terms of the influence of infrastructure. So this sort of got me interested in this idea of how spaces actually influence us. And so without going through a ton of research, we spend 80 to 90% of our lives in spaces. So whether it's this room, whether it's home, whether it's the office, spaces really do have an impact on us. So I just went through the literature really quickly, and not to read through this, but we can see things like alcohol use in these little tiny micro apartments where people are trying to achieve high density and jam people into these little tiny spaces. A lot of boredom, a lot of stress. There's physical impact, there's an emotional impact. People are less sociable in very tall high-rises. So there is an absolute impact on the spaces in which we occupy. However, it's not just the spaces we occupy, but it's the space around the space that we occupy. So if we think about the impact of nature and whether we have nature or not. And so I'd just like you to imagine for a second, if you're in these spaces, what do you actually feel? I noticed the cherry blossoms are out here. Yeah, amazing. So nature, we've just had this amazing talk on its impact, but even when we're looking at these pictures, right, we kind of feel lighter, we feel like, a little bit more relaxed. Cognitively, we're able to disconnect, we're less stressed, we're able to clear our minds. We slow down as well. Even our walking, our thinking, our breathing slows down. Gives us a space to play, a space to contemplate, and I think all of us can agree that nature is very important, and yet so many of our cities look like this. So despite what people value, this doesn't necessarily come out in our infrastructure. Yet some great cities get it right. So Singapore is a really good example of that. Without going over all of the research, Rowe and Aspinwall, I didn't realize that was you. There you go. So some of these studies we just looked at. Again, I won't go through all this, but just again, the idea that nature really does have an impact, whether that's on our emotional health, on our physical health, and it's really an untapped resource that cities overlook, but that even individuals tend to overlook until you're in it, and then we recognize those benefits. So the space is important, the space around the space is important, and getting to the space is also something that is very important as well. So this is the famous corridor from Dubai, Abu Dhabi. Every morning it's crowded like this, and every afternoon it just flips to the other side of people coming back in. There's another traffic corridor, Dubai Sharjah, which I think is 7 kilometers, and it can take up to 90 minutes one way to get there. So commuting, as we've heard, is rated actually as the worst part of anybody's day. But if you just imagine yourself in one of these cars parked on the freeway, or just perhaps going much slower than you would like, what that would feel like. Very frustrated, trapped, have other things to do. But I'm thinking even just the basics. If you're parked for 3 hours, how do you go to the bathroom? Right? Like, this is a pretty miserable experience. So I think Hussam talked a lot about this, but people who commute more tend to put on weight, more back and neck issues, spend less time with their kids, spend less time having time to prepare food, have less time actually to go and do exercise. Probably feel like doing exercise a lot less. When you get home, you're pretty exhausted. Divorce, we saw that statistic come up a couple of times, but it tends to be actually worse for women if the commuting partner is the man. And in part, not just because that stress is coming home with him, but while he's stuck in traffic, who has to do the cooking and the cleaning and taking care of the kids, right? So that second shift tends to fall on women. The other statistic that I found that was quite interesting is that for every extra hour of commuting in 1 week, a 40% increase in salary would have to be present to offset the costs. That's massive. So that when people move out to the suburbs, they think, yeah, we're going to save money on cheaper housing, but the time you lose is actually worth a lot, and it generally is not necessarily worth it. So when we think about, again, coming back to positive psychology, but kind of overlapping or overlaying that with infrastructure, bad design actually promotes negative emotions. People get pretty hostile, they get pretty irritable. Mediocre design, so again, this is the languishing. It's not necessarily bad, but it's not amazing either. It's just there, it's just a space. Just kind of, it's not a place to linger. You do what you got to do your work, go. You don't really want to hang out very much, and you feel a little bit boxed in. You don't feel terrible, but that human potential, that human capacity is not emerging either. Great spaces, however, are very different. So again, it's not just removing the negative, but it's building spaces so that they bring out the best of us. And these are spaces where people want to stay. They want to socialize, they want to connect, they want to innovate, they want to have fun, they want to cocoon, they want to be inspired. But actually, again, this is where we see the heights that humans are able to reach, and that often comes out in great design. And this really adds value to family life, to organizations, but also to cities and nations as a whole. So I recognize it's the end of the day. We're not done yet, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a chance to mingle, and you can get up and stretch as well. So if you can find somebody, preferably somebody that you don't know, I want you to describe what makes a great space. So think about one of the best cities you've ever been to. Describe what it was like. Maybe, if you are up on design, if you're able to describe that. Where was it? How did you get around? What was there to do? What did it feel like? And then describe one of the worst cities you've ever been to and why. So I'm going to give you about a minute and a half. Go find somebody. I hate to interrupt. You're all looking like you're getting along and making friends. So. Okay, so just curious, what are some descriptions, or how would you understand, or how would you frame a great space or a great city? You can just shout out your answers. Yes, go ahead. Okay. Okay, so walkability, but also it's interesting, because you could be walking down a back alley. Okay, so there's something to see. Okay, others? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Okay, yeah. So actually the nature of people's interactions already kind of influence that. Okay, others? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so safety in nature again, yes. Okay, so for you it's more the people, who is there and who is attracted to that city. Okay, how about horrible cities? What are some of the characteristics of those? That's usually an easier. Sorry? LA, okay, and why is that one like considered a horrible city? Okay. Okay, so commuting time. Other cities. Okay, and how come? Okay. 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 Yeah, so there's kind of this pulse to cities, and sometimes it draws us in, and other times it's like, I don't really want to be here. I don't like the feel of that. Okay, so when we think about what do we need or what can contribute to making happier places, it's exactly what you've talked about. So the people make a big difference, but also the place, the space in itself. So I just kind of went through the research literature a little bit, and again, when we look through, there's hundreds of different models of what contributes to happier places. So I just sort of pulled some of the major themes, but one is definitely nature. And I think, Auberlin, this sort of answers maybe some of your questions around, we talk about green spaces, but in a place like Dubai where it's desert, although they've done actually a really good job, maybe more in other cities outside, like Al Ain, which is really desert, is how do we bring in nature? So this picture right at the top right is actually a parking lot. They just got a big truck full of sand, ta-da, pop-up park, pop-up beach, and just created it. This picture down here at the bottom in the middle, that's actually fake grass. It's just little turf grass. They just made up a little pop-up park on those little, kind of the curbside. The bottom one, they're actually playing mini golf there. And the one above, that's also fake grass. Buckets, so this is rooftop gardens, so we can plant edible food, but also just flowers. So there are ways to bring in nature, even if it's not there naturally. Other things we need are surprise. So a little bit of excitement in cities. So art certainly goes a long way. So surprise can be something that is man-made, human-made. But also that's one of the benefits of nature, is that it also provides surprise naturally. So the seasons change, things die, things get replanted, and that also adds an element so that we don't adapt to what we see and then become immune to it. Other spaces give us reasons for coming together. So I don't know if anybody's ever gone to Calgary. I did my master's degree there. Yeah, exciting? No? Yeah, okay, all right. Oh, I love that, yeah. We actually went out of Calgary, and we like that, okay, yeah. So Calgary's cool, but the downtown core at 6 o'clock, ghost town. There's no reason to go there. It's just office towers. And so great spaces, great cities give people a reason to come together. So by putting in benches, parks, big games, chess games, but there's a reason to go, and people won't go if there's not a reason to go. Cities are also, good cities, good spaces are also built for introverts. So the nerdy thinking types like us who hang out on a Friday afternoon in conferences, we also need quiet spaces. So it's not just for those introverts, but even for the elderly or people who are recovering from mental illness or physical illness, families with kids. If you go to a mall, particularly in Dubai, the malls are open quite late, very late, sometimes till 3 a.m. During Ramadan, it's 24 hours. There are kids having epic meltdowns at midnight, and I'm thinking, I feel for you. I'm on the edge of having a nervous breakdown myself, and quiet spaces are definitely needed in cities as well. So it got me thinking, and maybe this is kind of a nice way to end the conference, is what do we do from here? So we, certainly having these conversations, bridging psychology, bridging sociology, urban planning, architecture, all these different fields, but what's the way forward? And I certainly don't have all of those answers, but to at least start thinking about how do we make this a topic of interest, but also a topic of importance. And so one is to start broadening the curricula to start including well-being for the architects, designers, urban planners, and I think they are doing a really good job. There's certainly room to go, but starting to introduce this topic as something that matters to students in university so that by the time they get into the workforce and are ready to start developing cities or spaces, that is already on their mind. Conversely, is broadening humanities to also be including questions of infrastructure. So I can only speak as a psychologist. We're really bad at this. We ask all sorts of questions. Tell me about your kids, tell me about your work, tell me about your stress. We never ask, but where do you live? And what does that look like? So I just have a short anecdote. So my students, again, I teach in the Emirates, and they are constantly sending me homework at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, I know university students do that anyway, but one day I just thought, okay, I'm going to ask, why aren't you people sleeping, right? And the students said, Miss, there's 17 people in our house. I only get peace and quiet at 2 a.m. That's why I'm doing my homework. Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Right? So when we ask, where do you live? What does that look like? Is it overcrowded? Is it noisy? Are you comfortable where you live? We also get answers that we probably wouldn't before. And although psychologists might not say, you need to move, maybe we will one day. As it stands, we will tell people, maybe you need to quit your job. Maybe you need to leave this relationship. Maybe you need to think about a different space. Another thing we need to do is maybe make good design as important as safety. So there was a time, maybe, I don't know, I read this somewhere, but I can't remember. Anyhow, maybe about 100 years ago, where we did not have fire extinguishers. Today, every single building has a fire extinguisher. You have to. Is there a way that we can start making good design as vital as safety? We actually build that into the building code. Maybe that's a role for developers, urban planners, whatnot, to start making it a standard that they will abide so that it forces perhaps municipalities, cities, and governments to adopt that as well. Coming back to the expats, one thing I'd like to see, not just for expatriates around the world, but even for organizations within countries, so perhaps in the US, who offer housing to employees, to make HR, to make housing an issue of HR as well. So if you're going to house me, you also have a responsibility to ask me, how's that working out? Versus, well, you have a space, and do you have a space? But again, the impact that space has on our productivity and our mental health, but also our eventual turnover and contribution and commitment to organization, it makes a difference. So HR has an interest in asking us that. The other space that I see is thinking about educating the consumer. So I chose that 3-bedroom apartment because it was the biggest apartment. But in reality, I should have picked this sunnier apartment that had more windows, and then maybe just downsized with my furniture. So again, we give people advice on how to choose a major, on the food guide, how to eat. Is this also something we need to educate consumers around, is how to look for good spaces, and how do we make those decisions? I think there's a huge amount of scope for more research. So certainly this field is, with all of the researchers we've heard over the last 2 days, is something that is definitely picking up here, but also extending that research to other parts of the world as well would go a long way. And it's not just doing research on issues of how infrastructure impacts health, mental health, and other questions like that, but even asking or reinterpreting some of the data that we have through a lens of infrastructure. And I just want to just give a quick example. I only have 2 or 3 more slides, then I'll wrap up. So the research I do is actually looking at contributors of contributors to life satisfaction. This is one of the studies that we just finished. And we did this using the Gallup World Poll data in the UAE. We had a sample size of about 17,000 participants. And I won't go through all of the results, but again, just thinking, how do we translate findings through the lens of infrastructure? So we looked at what are the things that make the biggest difference. And you can see in the red for both male and female, satisfaction with standard of living. Where you live matters. If you're not happy with your housing, that will actually bring you down in life satisfaction. So one of the studies that we're working on now is to look at all of the GCC countries, but the difference between expats and nationals. So just anecdotally, yes, there is a difference. And satisfaction with standards of housing is one of those. The other thing that we see that contributes to life satisfaction is living in a city. So again, thinking of the UAE, people who lived in Dubai were much happier than in the other Emirates, simply because there's more to do. And there's more different amenities, attraction, green spaces, and so again, that contributes as well. Feeling attached to the community, that contributed for men, not for women, and just more out of interest. For men, having a huge family, more kids contributed to life satisfaction. Women, no. Instead for them it was, I want to work for myself. How do I be an entrepreneur? So again, taking into consideration gender and how gender responds to space and how that meets their needs as well. The other thing that we saw that Carol talked about yesterday is that U-shaped dip. So again, we see this pretty much worldwide, although in the UAE it looks a little different. So it comes down, it doesn't come up much. And this kind of got me thinking about space. So if we think about people about 55, 60, and we actually cut that off simply because when you reach 60 in the UAE, there's no more work visas. But also the population pyramid in the UAE is lots of kids, not a lot of old people. So we just kind of stopped there. We didn't have enough people to continue. But in terms of spaces, there's really nothing to do or nowhere to go at that age, other than at home, men go to the mosque and the shopping mall. And so one of the developments that the UAE government has announced about 3 months ago was the development of community centers. These did not exist previously in the UAE, and they've targeted them specifically to older people, so they can go and have a space and learn, play the violin or whatever, different classes, different activities. The other thing that we found, we also looked at how the data looked differently for different age groups. And if you look at youth, at the very bottom, big differences compared to older, their parents and grandparents. So friends, community attachment did not contribute to life satisfaction. So how do we build spaces that bring youth into the community, getting off their phones and interacting with people is another issue as well. So these are just examples of, we can look at research that was done for completely different purposes, but to think about what does that mean in terms of infrastructure in space. So I'm going to end there, and feel free to connect if you have questions or comments. I am open, and otherwise, thank you so much. And I recognize it's Friday, so don't feel bad if you're... And there's another mic here. Sorry, I took one, but...
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
So I had two questions, but I won't take up too much time, I hope. The first has to do with this idea. I remember when I first moved to the Middle East, I worked in education, and every time teachers and educational professionals would go to a training, they'd come back and there would be a new requirement to add whatever they learned in that training to a lesson. And so at the end of a year, it's like 27 great ideas that have to be in every single lesson.
Thanks.
I'm wondering if that same phenomena might be happening in our cities, that once we see a good idea, we're seeing food trucks everywhere. We're seeing giant games everywhere. We're seeing pop-up stuff everywhere. And do we get to a point of saturation where maybe having all of the great things in all of the cities, can that have a diminishing effect after time?
That's a good question. I don't know, and I think that's where more research needs to be done. I mean, one thing we do know just from positive psychology is this idea of adaptation. So anything great and amazing, we eventually adapt to. So if I always just take the chocolate cake example, you can really love it, but if you eat it every day, you will soon get sick of it. So although we have, the pop-up trucks, and I know exactly in Dubai, it's a trend starts and then there's 50 of them, and then another trend starts, there's 50 of them. So we have a lot of great things, but after a while it just becomes too much, and people there's kind of that point of saturation, and then people kind of stop. I would say, and again, thinking about just the principles of positive psychology, there's that, and also nature as well. There's the fascination, the kind of new, the surprise, that's good too. But then there's also that social connection, and that's another piece as well. So maybe it's about balancing the new with the social connection so that there's an additional reason to go there, and it's not just the Instagram value, but what actually happens there as well. I don't know if that answered your question, but...
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for your interesting presentation. Talking about space, how does Japan compare with other places, for example? I don't know if there are studies on that, because obviously there is no space in Japan. Plenty of water, plenty of probably of a value system that respects nature. So probably they have an internal way of even with, showing their respect for a little plant to regain their peace and stability. But space is certainly something that can be stressful from, our perspective when we look at Japan, because there is none. Everybody has to sleep in a very tiny apartment and somehow adjust to it. I was wondering if there are any cross-cultural studies on space and mood and space and...
Yeah, I mean, I think, Berlin, you touched on this yesterday, this idea of overcrowding. So there's kind of that optimal number, and then the point beyond that, we tend to maybe want to seclude ourselves and maybe start avoiding people. Yeah, I'm not up on that literature around crowding and space. Sorry. Thank you so much.
So we have come to the end of this conference, and she's out of the room, but I want to thank Kate for really organizing everything and constantly behind the scenes doing all the detail work. And of course, to the BSOS ambassadors, these are the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences ambassadors, these students right here, who help us in all kinds of ways, and we're grateful for your help and appreciate you being here. Thank you very much. And of course, to the speakers who agreed to come to make fascinating presentations that really have enriched, I think, our experiences. Those of us who sat and listened to you gained a lot from what you had to offer to us. And as I said, we hope to disseminate this knowledge far and wide. And to the audience who came, I know that it's not easy to come and sit for 2 days, but I didn't feel at all burdened with having to sit for 2 days and listen to these fabulous speakers. As you know, that we will have all the talks on our YouTube channel at the Bahá'í Chair's website, and we hope that if you want to go back and hear these wonderful presentations, that's one way to do that. And I, again, appreciate all of your support. I wish all the speakers the best travel and safe travels, and we'll be in touch. And please, in the program for this conference, you notice there are 2 upcoming events. One is this Tuesday that has to do with the economic situation, especially with the less developed countries. We have a panel of 2 individuals who've done some work in this area, and a moderator that's going to go into discussions about this. And then our last event for this year is Donna Zuckerberg, who has written a very interesting book that examines the white supremacists movement in this country. And she's a classicist, and she looks at it from the perspective of how the white supremacists are trying to envision their own approach to misogyny, to how women should behave in society. And it's a very interesting book. It has done very well with reviews. Anyway, Donna Zuckerberg, that's on April 23rd, and it's an evening program at 7:30. So we hope you will join us, and again, thank you so much for being here, and safe travels home. Okay, bye.